Hello, everyone, and welcome to lecture number 2 in chapter 14. In our previous lecture, we looked at some reforms in the church and how it led to a boom in spirit towards the religion, so much so that it actually helped and lead to our second main topic in that lecture, the Crusades. So now in this lecture, we're going to look at how medieval society changes over the period of the Middle Ages, so 500 to 1500. So we're going to kind of focus in terms of how medieval society changes. And again, we're looking more in the latter half of the Middle Ages during this chapter. All right, so um, set the stage for you guys. So we talked about in chapter 13 how in Western Europe, when in the beginning of the Middle Ages, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, you saw people leave towns. So in the latter half of this, specifically after the Crusades, or towards the end of them, you're starting to see more people. That trend is going to reverse. You're going to see more people go back into towns and cities, and they're going to start to grow. And it's because you're seeing a population explosion, and you're seeing the access for work and so forth in these towns flourish for a variety of reasons that we're going to get into today and moving forward. But Western Europe is starting to expand rapidly, not just from a population standpoint, but territorially, you're seeing an expansion there as well. And with all this growth and learning, particularly from the connections, the cultural diffusion that you see from Western Europeans coming into contact with Muslims as well as the Byzantines themselves, you see a growth in learning. And with this money coming in, the expansion of trade, this population explosion, and this diffusion of learning and other things, you're going to start to see the development of the university system that we see that is very popular from a college standpoint or a higher education standpoint all around the world today. All right, so one of the reasons for why you see this explosion from a population standpoint and growth in Europe is you see a growth in farming. There's one, you see advancements taking off in terms of new techniques and technology. We'll talk about a couple here. And then two, you see the warming of the climate. I mentioned back in chapter 13, one of the reasons why the Middle Ages is termed the Dark Ages, specifically the early part of it, is because of the climate. It's colder. And that climate leads to, in several instances, in particular, the one that we really talk about, the Vikings, in raiding parts of Europe and leads to some of the problems. So a warmer climate allows for more people to grow food, and it allows for more food to be grown in the places that you can grow food. So you have those new lands to open to cultivation, particularly in the instance of the Vikings in Scandinavia. And that helps kind of slow and stop the raids eventually, along with the many other reasons we talked about previously. Some changes. You see horses are put on to plow fields. So that's different from primarily you seeing oxen that were used to plow the fields with the plow. Horses move a lot quicker than oxen, so they're actually able to plow the fields much faster. You also see really why they're able to do this is the new piece of technology is that they are able to put on the horse is the cross harness, and it just hooks up to them. It allows the horses to be very comfortably hooked up to the plow, and then they can go in. And then you start to see more because of this faster plowing and able to get more fields done. You see more forests that are cut down for farmland, and if you have more farmland, you can grow more food, better climate. It leads to a population explosion. Now, I want you guys to star this one. This is a really important thing to remember, or system that's developed during this time period to remember. So you have what's known as the three-field system that develops during this time period in the Middle Ages and gets improved upon in the latter half and moving forward. So in the 800s, you start to see villages begin to farm three fields. And I don't mean that they just have three fields. It's a system. So every three fields they try to do this. So, and usually what they were doing before is they were doing on two. They were using what was known as the two-field system. So essentially, you farm of each three fields, you farm two of them, and then you leave one field fallow or rest it. You don't seed it. Generally, you're going to use that field for animals to graze for two reasons. One, it allows the soil to regenerate just from not putting seeds in there, which will take nutrients out of the soil, but also by allowing the animals to graze on it, it gives them an area to feed, but also their dung, their manure is going to put more nutrients back into that field. And then what they'll do is they'll crop rotate that every year and switch it. So you'll have 2 years on for a field, 1 year off, and it allows the system to regrow or nutrients to get back into the fields, and it allows for better crop growth. And not only that, if when you take the idea of moving from the 3-field system or the 2-field system to the 3-field system, you now have a 16-17% growth in land that you are just previously that you now can farm on, and then add on what we just talked about in terms of the faster ability to plow and more forests are cutting down, the growth for area that you can farm, and the output into it is just so much. And this is why the population increase happens. You have better fed people, more access to food, children are living longer, they're holding off disease, people, not just children but everybody else is holding off disease much better, and you're living longer, and you have the population explosion. All right, so what this population explosion does is when you have excess food, it allows people to, in any instance in history and even today, if you have enough food, it allows people to start to specialize in different or kind of go off into different businesses and different workings than just farming. So there's a merchant and trading class in Europe developed at this time. There has been for centuries. And one thing that you start to see organized here during this period are guilds. And a guild is an organization of an occupation working to improve the conditions for that particular occupation. So, like if you're a set of barrel makers, you have a guild for barrel makers, or cobblers that make shoes, you have a guild for cobblers, and so forth. The first guilds that are developed were specifically just for merchants, and it was for two things. One, to control the trade and set up standards for trading, and two, providing security for that trade so that you're not getting robbed and having things stolen from you, whether it's money or goods. But guilds, really why they're important is that third bullet point. They set standards for work, so like work hours, conditions, and so forth. They set standards for pay and standards for training. And what this allows for is not only the betterment of those industries, but it allows for a greater sense of wealth, greater access to it, and stronger influence across Europe from these organizations, these working economic organizations. Now, all of this stuff, the advancements in farming, the advancements in terms of organization of guilds and trading and setting up standards, leads to the commercial revolution. And this is a combination of all these things that I've talked about and then adding and learning into it. So what you end up seeing is various fairs. Kind of think of it in terms of like the Renaissance fair would be the closest connection that you kind of see to this day, but or like farm markets in a more traditional sense of action. You see fairs that are set up in towns to trade, and they move across Europe and trade various goods. Some they get from towns they go to, some they have access from trading in ports along the Mediterranean and so forth. But you see different things traded, like different forms of cloth and dyes and salt and different products. And what this ultimately does is, if you guys remember, we talked about the feudal system in Europe that developed in the early stages of the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and led to the manor system and so forth. The market system here starts to end the need for the manor system, because now your people are going to have access to goods and so forth that they don't necessarily need to just produce on their manor. They can go and start to specialize in different areas. You're not necessarily tied to the land. You don't have to be work in just your own little self-sufficient community. You now have access to goods that are outside of your realm, and you can expand your connections. And this leads to trade spreading all across Europe, availability of foreign goods. And here, what we mean by foreign is it could mean like from Asia or Africa, but it also could mean like goods are now reaching France from southern Spain, or goods from what present day Czech Republic are reaching England, or something like that, is what I'm trying to say. So with all this money coming in and coming in and out of Europe, you see the development of banking really for the first time during this period. With all these advances, you need the ability to stash your money and also allow for credit to be set up, and exchange rates depending on different markets and systems, and let's say England versus Italy and so forth. So there's the supply and demand's difference. So it's a more developed economic system that needs to be put in place, and banking and lines of credit are developed. So what this does is they start allowing people to borrow money at interest, or what's called usury. Um, and this was actually forbidden by the church. But as the trading systems itself take up over time, the church actually softens on this forbidden practice with usury, because they realize that they can actually benefit from it and help themselves out. And I don't mean this in a greedy term. I mean it in terms of like helping building of churches, helping funding programs for medical purposes, or the poor, or for learning purposes. So that does soften. But ultimately, what this does is it changes society. Because remember, guys, I told you at the beginning, you have people moving back to the cities. And anytime that you have access to more food and there's advances in trade, you have people that are going to flock to different forms of jobs and to the jobs that are popular. And typically, where do you see the growing number of different industries go? They go to cities or towns. And this means that big cities are going to start to develop in this period in Europe. So as urban life starts to take off and population rises, trade really becomes the lifeblood of Europe. You see that Europe over this period, and continuing into the centuries moving forward, and in the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, people will focus towards the cities, and industry and trade become the focus away from agriculture. Not that agriculture isn't important; it still remains important through all this period. But you see less and less people focused in that, because they can make enough food and have access to enough food for people to do other things. So you see the population of Europe in really around the time of the First Crusades, raised by 12 million people. That's a huge growth during this period. Paris becomes this very significantly large city, roughly about 60,000. We think that's small today. And in Europe specifically, back in this time, that's massive, and it's only going to grow from there. But even though there's all this growth and there's these positives to it, there are going to be some problems. One, the narrow streets of the towns and cities of Europe are going to cause problems, going to clog up areas. It's going to help foster the expansion and growth of diseases. And then you add in the fact that people and animals and their wastes are really close together, and you don't have modern plumbing and sewers. So all these bad conditions mean that there's disease can run rampant. There's also a lot of these buildings, since they're built close together, and then a lot of the new structures are built with wood. It means that there's a lot of fire hazards and so forth. So even though people are flocking to cities because there's jobs and there's this new growth, is some bad there in terms of lack of plumbing, disease, and fire hazards being a problem. So what ends up happening is that feudal system is breaking down, the manor system's breaking down, as we've talked about, and serfs start to run away from their manors to cities, because the life is so harsh on the manors. They want some form of freedom, to work differently, to have the chance to to grow and advance themselves. And part of the reason why this ends up happening is not just because of the growth in jobs and so forth, but towns start to develop laws that towns make you free. And in certain areas across Europe, there's laws that if you're able to establish residency from regardless of where you come from for a specific period, in some cases a year, some cases less, in some cases more, that you're free and you do not have to actually go back to the manor that you escaped from for serfs. So that's a huge draw. And then what ends up happening is because of this draw for serfs coming in, you have obviously your upper class people, but trading takes off. You have the development of a merchant class or a middle class, and in a lot of cases, people have burghers that are developed during this period. And all of this, we talked about learning. This is going to be the focus here. We've talked about a trade and population explosion from agriculture. Well, there's that learning revival and explosion. The contact that Western Europe has with the Byzantines to the east and the Muslims to the east rekindles that spark in learning that was lost with the end of the Western Roman Empire and that division that was brought by the invasions from people like the Vikings and Huns and the development of the feudal system. And the Crusades bring that back. And that's a very, very important thing. And you see a rediscovery of knowledge from the Greeks and Romans, specifically in science and math, that lead to these advancements. And you see the first universities in the world develop. Now, at first, they're focused on religious teachings, theology. You see the development and creation of what are known as bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. You can see initially bachelor's degrees are set out to be 5 to 7 years in length in education, master's at 12. Today, for bachelor's degrees, it's typically 4 to 5, and master's degrees is typically anywhere from 6 to 8, depending on the program, is what you're looking at now to kind of see how that's transitioned. Literature, from a literature standpoint, you see with all this learning, the development of vernacular writing, so the use of writing in everyday language, so kind of moving away from Latin and focusing on the writing in terms of like Italian or French or English. This develops during this period. You see great works that are still studied to this day in high school and in college and many other places. In particular, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. We'll actually read some of this. We'll actually take a quiz in terms of see which circle of hell that you guys actually function in or would fit into based on some questions. You guys either have read or will read parts of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And these works were developed during this period. And the reason why they've become so famous is a variety of reasons. But during their time, they were famous works of art or works of literature because they were written in the vernacular. And by writing in the vernacular, it gave access for more people to learn how to read. And that's an important advancement. These are the 9 circles of hell that are put forth in Dante Alighieri's work in the Inferno and so forth. But we won't go through all of these directly right now because we'll actually focus more specifically on these when we get to the Renaissance and come back to this exact same slide there. But you can stop it, take a look at what these circles are, and just know that we will come back to this in chapter 17. Here's a famous piece of art that we'll actually revisit again when we get to chapter 17 and talk about the Renaissance. But this is linked directly to Alighieri's or Dante's Inferno. Last slide here. We see a development in philosophy, mainly because of that connections with Western Europe having connections with the Byzantines and the Muslims. They have connections back specifically to the works of the ancient Greeks, and philosophy was a huge thing that was very important in Greek culture, specifically like if you look at Plato or you look at Socrates, and you see the development and connection with medieval works here where they take logic and truth of philosophical means, try to improve upon them and connecting it with the faith of the Christian religion, that specifically the teachings of the Bible. And St. Thomas Aquinas, who's at the top here, view that religion could be proved by logic in this ideal. And you see these combining of teachings of religion with the works of like people like Aristotle from ancient Greece, um, and and so forth by pressing this matter and connecting the philosophy of the ancient Greeks with the Christian faith. And you see the development of scholastics or schoolmen to debate these issues. And this is important solely for the fact that when you can this development of medieval philosophy and this connection and these debates that are brought by these scholastics, you actually see the first development of democratic institutions in Western Europe happen at this time. And this is going to kind of be that kernel that's going to sprout the seed for the development of really this Renaissance, moving into the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment, that will lead to the development of the great democratic states of or democratic movement, that will lead to the founding of our country, the United States. So there's these connections that start small and then grow over time, and this is an example of one of them. All right, guys, that's all I got for you today. Please make sure you guys go back and review this and see these changes. A lot of these changes are very important to understand not only the content for this chapter, but where they came from in the previous chapters, and really as we move forward throughout the rest of this year, specifically coming back and talking about Europe in chapter 17, 19, and 20. These will play an important role. So please make sure you guys go review this. All right, guys, I will see you for section 3 in just a little bit. Bye.